Good evening. Tonight we begin with breaking news that marks a rare and unsettling moment in American political and legal history. Impeachment proceedings are advancing, but this time, they are moving forward alongside something far more immediate and far more consequential. Judges are now openly warning Donald Trump that continued defiance of court orders could carry real consequences, including the possibility of jail. This is no longer abstract accountability. This is not a symbolic process unfolding at a distance. This is the judiciary signaling that the line between political power and legal consequence has been crossed. American history does not see this often. Impeachment has traditionally lived in the political realm, debated on television, argued in Congress, framed as partisan conflict. But what makes this moment different is that it is unfolding in parallel with active judicial enforcement. Courts are no longer operating in the background. They are stepping forward publicly and asserting authority in language that leaves little room for interpretation. That shift matters. Because when judges issue warnings like these, they are not engaging in rhetoric, they are documenting behavior. They are establishing a record. And they are making clear that compliance is not optional, regardless of status, office, or political influence. This wasn't supposed to happen, yet it did. A former president, once the most powerful figure in the country, now faces advancing impeachment and direct judicial caution at the same time. That convergence is rare, it is consequential, and it forces a question the system has long avoided: what happens when political theater gives way to real legal jeopardy? To answer that, we need to step back and understand how we arrived at this moment. To understand why this moment feels so different, heavier, sharper, more consequential, we need to look at how impeachment has functioned in the past. Historically, impeachment has remained largely political. It unfolded inside Congress, framed through hearings, speeches, and votes. The consequences were debated, interpreted, and often delayed. Even when impeachment was serious, it existed mostly as a test of political will rather than an immediate threat of enforcement. That is not what we are seeing now. What makes this moment fundamentally different is the parallel track unfolding alongside impeachment. As Congress advances its constitutional process, criminal courts are asserting their authority at the same time. Judges are not waiting for political outcomes. They are responding to conduct, issuing warnings, setting boundaries, and signaling consequences that do not depend on election cycles or partisan alignment. This convergence is rare. Impeachment as symbolism has collided with impeachment that carries consequences. For the first time in modern history, a former president is facing advancing impeachment proceedings while simultaneously being cautioned by judges that continued defiance could result in real penalties. That changes the nature of the entire process. Political defenses that once absorbed pressure now offer limited protection in a courtroom. Let that sink in. This is not just Congress acting. This is the judicial system stepping forward independently, reinforcing the idea that accountability does not pause for political convenience. And once courts enter the picture this directly, the stakes shift from messaging to compliance. To understand how this became possible, and why judges are now speaking so plainly, we need to look at the legal foundation behind those warnings. When judges issue public warnings, they are not making political statements. They are laying legal groundwork. In practical terms, these warnings serve several purposes. First, they establish a clear record that the court has identified problematic conduct. Second, they put explicit boundaries in place, often through mechanisms like gag orders, restrictions on public statements, or conditions that function much like probation. And third, they signal that further violations will not be met with patience, but with enforcement. This is how courts protect their authority. Contempt of court is not a dramatic concept, it is a procedural one. It exists to ensure compliance with lawful orders. When judges warn that contempt could lead to sanctions, including detention, they are not threatening punishment. They are describing the escalation path the law requires if defiance continues. What makes this moment extraordinary is who is receiving those warnings. American courts almost never publicly caution a former president in this way. Judges are acutely aware of institutional optics, political volatility, and historical precedent. Silence and restraint are usually preferred. When that restraint gives way to direct language, it reflects concern that ordinary judicial tools may no longer be sufficient. This marks a shift. The image of an untouchable political figure collides with a different reality, a defendant who is subject to the same authority as anyone else who enters a courtroom. The law does not adjust itself for office once held. It adjusts only to behavior shown. Imagine being warned like this while running for president. That tension between political power and legal accountability is not theoretical. It is now unfolding in real time. And to understand why courts feel compelled to speak so plainly, we need to look at the behavior that brought us here. To understand why courts are now losing patience, you have to look at the pattern that brought us here. When faced with legal pressure, Donald Trump's response has been remarkably consistent. He does not retreat, he delays. He challenges legitimacy. And when constraints tighten, he escalates, often publicly. Court proceedings are reframed as political persecution. Judges become targets, witnesses are attacked. Institutions themselves are cast as partisan actors. This approach has long served a political purpose. It rallies supporters. It reframes accountability as conflict, and it buys time. But courts do not operate on political timelines. Judicial tolerance is built on the expectation of compliance. Judges allow speech criticism, even sharp rhetoric, up to a point. That point is crossed when statements begin to interfere with proceedings, intimidate participants, or undermine the administration of justice itself. And that is where patience wears thin. From the judiciary's perspective, repeated defiance is not messaging, it is behavior. And behavior is what courts regulate. Each warning issued, each order clarified, is part of a documented effort to preserve due process. When those efforts are ignored, escalation is not optional. It is procedural. Political bravado may succeed on a campaign stage. Judicial tolerance does not bend the same way. This is the moment restraint runs out. Because once courts conclude that warnings are being treated as optional, the conversation shifts. It moves away from speech and toward enforcement. And that shift dramatically increases legal risk, not in theory but in practice. To see how that risk becomes real, we need to understand the legal mechanisms that courts use when defiance continues. To understand how jail time even enters the conversation, it's important to strip away the emotion and look at the law itself. What courts are dealing with here is not punishment, it is enforcement. The legal mechanism is contempt of court. Contempt exists to protect the court's ability to function. When a judge issues an order, whether it's a gag order, a restriction on conduct, or a directive tied to the integrity of a case, compliance is not optional. If that order is violated, courts follow an escalation ladder that is procedural, predictable, and well-established. It begins with warnings, then clarifications, then sanctions, often fines or additional restrictions. And if violations continue, courts may order temporary detention, not to punish past behavior, but to compel future compliance. That distinction matters. Jail in this context is not about vengeance or politics. It is about enforcing authority when all other measures have failed. Courts have used this tool many times. Against business executives who ignored subpoenas, activists who violated injunctions, and public officials who defied court orders. The individuals involved were powerful in their own spheres, but once inside a courtroom, the same principle applied. Above the law does not exist in American jurisprudence. Equal before the law does. What makes this moment extraordinary is not the legal pathway. That pathway is routine, but the person standing on it. A former president has never tested this boundary so directly, so publicly, and so persistently. And courts are responding not to who he is, but to what he is doing. This is where things get real. Because once enforcement becomes necessary, the conversation moves beyond legal theory and into constitutional meaning, raising profound questions about power, limits, and the rule of law itself. At its core, what we are witnessing is not simply a legal dispute or a political clash. It is a constitutional test. The American system is built on separation of powers, three co-equal branches designed to restrain one another. The executive enforces the law, Congress legislates and oversees, and the judiciary interprets and enforces compliance with the Constitution itself. That balance only works if no branch is allowed to place itself beyond accountability. When courts assert authority over a former president, they are not challenging democracy, they are preserving it. Judicial enforcement is the system's final safeguard. It exists precisely for moments when political power threatens to outrun legal limits. If courts hesitate here, if they treat status or office as insulation, the precedent would be devastating. It would signal that executive power, once accumulated, can linger beyond restraint. That is how democracies erode. Strongman politics depend on the perception that institutions will ultimately back down. Constitutional order depends on the opposite, that institutions hold even under pressure. Courts asserting authority in this moment are not acting aggressively. They are acting defensively, protecting the framework that allows democratic competition to exist at all. This is why the stakes feel so high. The question is no longer whether Trump complied with a specific order. The question is whether the rule of law applies equally when the individual involved once commanded the executive branch itself. This changes everything about American governance. Because once courts demonstrate that even the highest office does not grant immunity from enforcement, the system reasserts its boundaries. And once those boundaries are tested publicly, the consequences inevitably spill into the political arena. That's where this story moves next, from constitutional principle to political reality. At this stage, impeachment is often dismissed as symbolic. Too late, too political, too disconnected from immediate outcomes. But that interpretation misses what impeachment is actually doing right now. Impeachment is not only about removal from office, it is about signaling documentation and deterrence. Congress is creating an official constitutional record. It is establishing in formal terms what conduct crossed legal and democratic boundaries and when. That record matters, not just for today's headlines, but for courts, historians, future lawmakers, and the public memory of how institutions responded under pressure. Timing matters here. Impeachment unfolding alongside active judicial scrutiny reinforces a single message: accountability is not hypothetical. It is not postponed until elections. And it does not disappear simply because power has shifted hands. Congress is saying that conduct tied to democratic stability must be examined in real time, while its consequences are still unfolding. This is not too late. It is essential now. Because impeachment also functions as deterrence. It tells future office holders that norms are not optional and that abuse of power will be formally confronted, even if removal is no longer on the table. Silence would be easier. Inaction would be politically safer. But history does not judge institutions by convenience. This is not about today. It's about history. And once Congress acts, the focus inevitably shifts outward, from lawmakers to voters, from institutional process to public consequence. That is where the next phase of this story unfolds in the political and civic arena beyond Capitol Hill. Inside Washington, the reaction to this moment has been anything but unified. The advancing impeachment and judicial warnings have exposed fractures that many in the political class had worked hard to conceal. Among Republicans, the response splits sharply. Some hesitate, choosing silence, procedural objection, or carefully neutral language. For them, the risk is twofold: alienating a base that still sees Trump as a political force, while also avoiding direct conflict with courts whose authority is becoming impossible to dismiss. Others take the opposite approach, escalating rhetoric and framing judicial action as partisan overreach, betting that confrontation plays better than caution. Democrats, meanwhile, face a different tension. There is urgency, pressure to act decisively in defense of democratic norms, but also restraint. Many recognize that overt political aggression could undermine the legitimacy of the process itself. The strategy for now has been to let institutions speak for themselves, to allow judges, filings, and formal procedures to carry the weight, rather than inflaming the moment with maximalist messaging. This divide reveals the underlying conflict shaping Washington's response: political survival versus institutional duty. Elected officials calculate, institutions endure. What is striking is how quiet much of Washington has become. The usual flood of talking points slows when consequences become real. When courts assert authority, ambiguity becomes harder to maintain. Washington hears something the public doesn't yet. It hears the seriousness in judicial language. It senses the narrowing room for maneuver. And it understands that this moment will not be resolved by press conferences alone. As that reality sets in, attention begins to shift away from elite strategy and toward how the public will respond. At the center of this moment is not just a legal process or a political confrontation. It is a psychological pressure point. Donald Trump has always operated from a position of control. Control over narrative, control over timing, control over opponents. When challenged politically, he counters with rallies, media attacks, and reframing. That approach has worked because political conflicts are negotiable. They move, they bend, they respond to pressure. Courts do not. What makes judges more consequential than political opponents is precisely that they are insulated from spectacle. A judge does not campaign. A judge does not poll. A judge does not trade leverage. Authority flows in one direction, from the bench outward. That represents a fundamental shift in power dynamics. The loss of control is not symbolic, it is procedural. Deadlines cannot be delayed indefinitely. Orders cannot be reframed as opinion. And compliance is measured not by public reaction, but by conduct. For someone accustomed to shaping outcomes through dominance, that constraint creates tension, and often escalation. This is where dominance narratives collide with judicial reality. Political power thrives on perception. Judicial power thrives on enforcement. When those two systems intersect, the latter does not yield to the former. Power behaves differently when it's cornered, and that matters beyond the individual. Because once a former president confronts the limits of control, the system itself is tested. How institutions respond, firmly or hesitantly, signals to everyone watching whether authority still holds. That signal does not stop at the courthouse doors. It carries outward, shaping how this moment is understood far beyond the United States. This moment is not unfolding in isolation. It is being watched closely, far beyond Washington, far beyond American media, far beyond domestic politics. Allies are paying attention. For Democratic partners in Europe, Canada, Australia, and beyond, the question is simple but profound: does the American system still enforce the rule of law when it is most inconvenient? Courts asserting authority over a former president send a signal that institutions are functioning, that accountability does not collapse under political pressure. That matters for trust. At the same time, authoritarian governments are watching for a different reason. They are studying precedent. They are asking whether democratic systems actually restrain powerful figures, or whether those systems fracture when tested. For years, critics have pointed to American hypocrisy, preaching rule of law abroad while struggling to enforce it at home. This moment challenges that narrative. American hypocrisy versus American correction. If institutions hold, it strengthens democratic credibility globally. If they falter, it reinforces the argument that power ultimately outruns law, an argument authoritarian regimes rely on to justify repression. And this is why judicial language matters so much. Judges are not issuing statements for an international audience. Yet their actions resonate globally because they demonstrate whether democratic systems can self-correct without collapsing into chaos or vengeance. This moment echoes far beyond U.S. borders, because what happens here informs how democracy is understood elsewhere, not as an abstract ideal, but as a working system capable of confronting its own excesses. And as the world watches this unfold, attention begins to turn forward, to what happens next and what consequences may follow. If defiance continues, the path forward is neither mysterious nor improvisational. Courts do not invent responses in moments like this. They follow a structured escalation process that exists precisely to prevent chaos. It begins with financial penalties. Fines are imposed to signal seriousness and compel compliance. If those fail, courts move to sanctions, tighter restrictions, narrowed speech boundaries, increased oversight. Each step is documented, deliberate, and legally grounded. And if defiance persists, the final step becomes unavoidable: temporary detention to enforce compliance. This is where the public narrative often diverges from legal reality. The chaos narrative imagines sudden arrests, political spectacle, and institutional breakdown. The process reality is far more restrained. Courts move incrementally. They explain their reasoning. They create a record that justifies each action. The goal is not drama. It is compliance. That distinction matters. Judicial enforcement is not a reaction to politics. It is a response to behavior. And while political consequences may ripple outward, courts remain focused on a single question: are there lawful orders being followed? This is the part everyone fears to say out loud, not because it is radical, but because it is ordinary. The law already contains the tools required to handle defiance even by powerful individuals. What makes this moment unsettling is not the mechanism, but the identity of the person testing it. At this point, hypotheticals begin to narrow. Once warnings are issued and ignored, escalation is no longer speculative. It becomes procedural and increasingly inevitable. And that inevitability pushes this story beyond courtroom mechanics, toward its broader impact on elections, legitimacy, and democratic confidence. As this legal and constitutional confrontation unfolds, its effects are already seeping into the electoral landscape, reshaping how voters interpret power, accountability. For some voters, the response is instinctive. Legal pressure is reframed as persecution. Judicial warnings become evidence of bias. The narrative is familiar, an embattled figure standing against institutions portrayed as hostile or corrupt. This martyr framing has political power, especially in polarized environments where trust in institutions is already fragile. But there is another, quieter response emerging at the same time: accountability fatigue. A growing segment of the electorate is less interested in spectacle and more concerned with stability. For these voters, the question is not whether Trump is being targeted, but whether the system itself can function without constant crisis. Court enforcement in this view is not oppression, it is maintenance, a necessary act to preserve order when norms have frayed. This divide matters because it reshapes turnout, enthusiasm, and legitimacy. Elections thrive on confidence that rules apply equally, that outcomes are respected, and that no individual exists beyond consequence. When those assumptions erode, democratic participation changes. Some mobilize aggressively, others disengage entirely. Persecution story versus rule of law moment. That tension will define how this election is experienced, not just how it is contested. Campaigns will respond, messaging will sharpen. But beneath the noise lies a deeper test: whether voters see institutions as instruments of fairness or weapons of faction. This election is no longer just political. It has become a referendum on whether democracy enforces its own boundaries, and whether citizens still believe in the systems designed to protect them. And that brings us to the larger meaning of this moment. When you step back and look at this moment in full, the picture becomes clear. Courts, Congress, and voters are no longer operating in parallel lanes. They have converged on the same question: does the law still function when it is tested by power? Judges are asserting authority not to make a statement, but to enforce compliance. Congress is using impeachment not as spectacle, but as record, a formal accounting of conduct for history. And voters are being asked implicitly to decide whether accountability strengthens democracy or threatens it. This is not about a single individual. It is about whether democratic systems can absorb stress without breaking, whether they can confront excess without descending into revenge, and whether rules retain meaning when applied at the highest level. What democracy promises versus what it must prove. Moments like this define eras, not because they are loud, but because they are decisive. If institutions hold, they reaffirm the principle that no one stands above the law. If they hesitate, they teach a different lesson, one that echoes long after headlines fade. This is a historic crossroads, not dramatic in appearance, but profound in consequence. And while the immediate outcomes remain uncertain, one thing is clear: the choices made here will shape how authority, accountability, and legitimacy are understood for years to come. And yet, the story isn't over. What happens next will not unfold on a single stage. It will move across court calendars, congressional schedules, and political strategy rooms all at once. Judicial timelines are now set. Judges have issued warnings, clarified expectations, and narrowed the space for ambiguity. Courts move deliberately, but once a clock starts, it does not pause for campaign seasons or political calculations. Compliance will be measured, responses will be evaluated, and consequences, if necessary, will follow process rather than rhetoric. At the same time impeachment votes approach, Congress must decide not just how to act, but when, balancing urgency against legitimacy, speed against durability. Every decision adds to the historical record being built in real time. And then there is Trump's response. Will the strategy remain delay and defiance, or will legal reality force restraint? This is where two forces collide: the delay strategy that has worked in political arenas for years and the legal clock that does not negotiate. One depends on momentum, the other depends on procedure. Only one ultimately prevails. The uncertainty ahead is real. Outcomes are not predetermined. But the direction of pressure is clear, and it is narrowing. The next weeks may determine everything. And as events unfold, in courtrooms, in Congress, and in public reaction, we'll be here to break it down carefully, clearly, and without speculation as this extraordinary moment continues to take shape.